Welcome to the Natural Super Kids podcast, where you will discover practical strategies to inspire you to boost the health and nutrition of your kids. I'm Jessica Donovan, a qualified naturopath specialising in kids' health, and I want to make it as easy as possible for you to raise healthy and happy kids. Let's get into it. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Natural Super Kids podcast. Jessica Donovan here, and I am alone. We've been doing a lot of guest podcast episodes in the last couple of months, but we are going back to some solo episodes with just me. So today we are talking about worms and a holistic approach to treating worms in children. I wanted to cover this off as a podcast episode because it is one of our most popular blog posts that sits on our website. I'll link to the blog post in case you want this in written format as well. But I wanted to make sure that people who are not readers and are more listeners can get access to this great information as well, because one of the inevitable joys of parenting and being a mum is dealing with worms in kids. Most kids will pick up worms from daycare or school at some point, which can often lead to an infection of the whole body. Worms are often fairly harmless for most people, and I'm going to be talking about actually some of the upsides of worms for us as humans in a moment as well, but they can cause some unpleasant symptoms. Other people, and this is fairly common in a lot of kids that we see here at Natural Super Kids, can experience chronic infections because they become vulnerable to worms, and we're going to be talking about some of the reasons that can happen as well. So if your child is experiencing worm infections or infestations more than every 12 to 18 months, there might be an underlying cause that you want to explore further. So let's first talk about some of the common symptoms of worms in kids. So threadworms or pinworms are the most common worms to infect humans, and most of us have had an experience with a threadworm infection before. Other worm infections do occur on occasions, but they are typically picked up overseas while on holiday. So we're not going to be covering those sorts of worm infestations in the episode today. We're talking about the common threadworm and pinworm. So the most common signs and symptoms of worms in kids are, I think we all know this one, an itchy bottom, particularly 2 to 3 hours after kids go to bed, because this is when worms become more active. So that itchy bottom, and it can happen through the day as well, is that clear, that often that first sign that we think, what's going on here? In females, there can also be itchiness and redness around the vulva and vagina. And this is because, of the close proximity to the anus. So the worms can lay eggs around both, and girls can often experience UTI-like symptoms as well, urinary tract infection symptoms, if the worms enter the vagina or the urethra. So that, the constant need to go to the toilet, those sorts of things that mimic those urinary tract infection symptoms. There can also be behavioural changes. This is really common in worms, in kids with worms. So this can just range from just general irritability to mood swings, but often people do notice a change in behaviour and mood in their kids with worms. Restless sleep is another common symptom due to the itchiness and the activity of worms. Kids may wake up with their bedding all over the place. They might grind their teeth. They might feel unrefreshed in the morning. They might be cooling out at night, having nightmares, night terrors, bedwetting. So these are all common signs and symptoms of worms as well. But of course, these sorts of things can be linked to other issues and sleep problems too. But, if there's a sudden onset of these kinds of symptoms, then you should be thinking about worms. And a lack of appetite can be common with worms as well. But on the opposite side of the spectrum, it's possible to have worms without experiencing any symptoms at all. So there can be symptoms, but for some kids there aren't symptoms. So let's talk about how worms are spread, because there's a common misconception that kids can pick up worms from pets. The dog was licking him all over the face and that's why he got worms. But humans are the only known hosts for threadworms. And that means that kids are picking it up from other people or by reinfecting themselves. So it's only a human-to-human contamination when it comes to worms. The most common way for worms to spread is via the hands. So sorry if this is grossing people out, but, the very subject of worms means we do have to talk about these things. But worms lay their eggs on the surface of the skin around the anus, which can cause kids to itch around that area. And then the eggs get under their fingernails and then re-enter through the mouth or are transferred onto surfaces. So the eggs can live for 2 to 3 weeks outside of the body. In some cases, worms can even be contracted by breathing in airborne eggs. So because it's so easy for the worms to spread, it is common for them to be picked up in the classroom or at daycare. Again, pretty yucky to be thinking about, but kids are fairly unhygienic creatures. Worms will spread through the family as well, which is why when you notice one child having symptoms, it is really the best idea to treat the whole family. Although worms are typically a digestive infection, you can have worms anywhere with a wet orifice. There are cases of worms infecting the nose, ears, salivary glands, vagina, as we talked about before, and urinary tract. And one of the main causes of recurrent infection is that standard worming medication only targets the digestive tract and cannot treat any other infection areas. So I think this is really useful to know, particularly if you have a child that is continually getting reinfected with worms. So how do you treat worms? Look, even though I'm a naturopath and I'm all about, naturopathic medicines and herbs and things like that, I do recommend the first port of call to be the over-the-counter medicine for worms, Pyrantel or Combantrin, as is the most common brand name here in Australia. So unlike many other medications, there are few side effects of this medication, the Pyrantel. They are low toxicity and most of it isn't actually absorbed into the system. The medication works within the digestive tract and it works by paralyzing the worms so the body can excrete them. Worming medications for kids are in little chocolate squares, which also makes them really easy to give to kids. They taste good. It's one dose. And so, with helping kids take them, it's not too hard is what I'm trying to say. The one downside of medications such as Pyrantel or Combantrin, as it's commonly known, is that it's most effective to have 2 courses, which a lot of parents don't know, because it only attacks the live worms in the gut and not the eggs. As I said, it works by paralyzing the worms so that the body can excrete them, but it doesn't work on the eggs. So doing 1 dose immediately and following up with a second dose 1 to 2 weeks later is often more effective. Look, for some kids, 1 dose is enough, but if you're finding that isn't and it's an ongoing issue, then you do definitely want to be doing that second dose 1 to 2 weeks later. And then after using worming medication, I recommend following up with some good quality probiotics to boost overall gut health and gut bacteria levels. So when we're talking about herbs, there are anti-parasitic and anti-worming herbs that can be useful for chronic infections, but herbs are not usually my first choice when it comes to kids because they can taste quite awful, and unlike the medication where you just need 1 or 2 doses, you need to be taking herbs for 2 to 6 weeks for the best outcome. If your kids can swallow tablets, that is definitely the best, or capsules, that is the best way to take these anti-parasitic herbs, because the liquid version of them is not going to go down well with most kids because of the taste. So not all anti-parasitic herbs are effective against worms. Some of the most effective herbs to treat worms are wormwood, as the name suggests, myrrh, and pomegranate, clove, black walnut. But I highly, highly, highly recommend getting advice from a qualified practitioner, and we can help with that in our consultations. I'll make sure there's a link to the show notes for our online consultations. Do not give these herbs to your kids without first speaking to a naturopath or some sort of qualified practitioner. But as I said, my first choice is to go down the medication route, the pyrantel or combantrin. And if there is the chronic infections, then you might want to look at herbs. So I also just want to talk a bit about the gut environment, because whenever there's a recurrent problem with worms in kids, it's important to look at what is going on in the gut that is contributing to this. Gut health plays a huge role in preventing worms, particularly when it comes to gut bacteria. So some strains of that healthy bacteria that we can find in the gut have been found to clear worms in the gut and protect against infection. And research shows that some microbes in the gut affect the severity and recurrence of worm infestations. So to conclude, really to put this simply, the healthier the balance of gut bacteria, the greater protection your kids will have against worms. And again, to optimize the environment within your kid's gut, it is great to work with a practitioner, but I will also pop a link to a free ebook we have, Gut Health for Kids, which will go through the fundamentals of improving your child's overall gut health. Now, I'd also just want to talk a little bit about a novel approach to chronic worms. So an amazing naturopath named Rachel Arthur has sort of developed this novel approach to chronic worm infection. So I want to explain this to you. And this is highlighted in the blog post that has been live on our website for a couple of years, and we've been using this approach for families that have been seeking our help, and with some really good results. So Rachel was seeing people who were experiencing severe mood swings, sleep disorders, and more due to worms, and she started looking into researching why certain people are prone to longer and more severe infections. And what she found was a really interesting vet science study exploring why some animals can rid themselves of worms and others are prone to infections. And what this study found was that the more prone animals had a lower level of a substance called chondroitin sulfate. Why is this significant? Well, the white blood cells that are involved in worm infections, they're called basophils, secrete chondroitin sulfate. So somehow this chondroitin sulfate is creating an unhealthy environment for worms. And because chondroitin sulfate is a really safe supplement, it's easy to give to kids. We've been recommending this for kids with chronic worm infections with some really good results. So there definitely needs to be some more studies to confirm its benefits, but because it's such a safe supplement and it is supporting the white blood cells, the particular white blood cells that are involved in worm infection called basophils, it's taking that more systemic approach to addressing worm infections, that the worm medication that we talked about before that's only working in the digestive tract is, so it's getting on top of more systemic infections of worms. And that's why it can be so helpful. So that is something definitely to think about. Again, if you're wanting to to try this with your child, make sure you are seeking some professional advice. And as I said, we can help with that in one of our naturopathic appointments, even if it's just an express appointment to talk over a few treatment options if you didn't want to go the whole kit and kabang with an initial and a treatment plan consultation, which is the structure that we work with consultations. So once you have treated the worms, or in the process of treating worms, you also want to think about preventing worms in kids. So treating worms is the first step, but what you really want to do is prevent ongoing infections. And so I've got some tips that will help you to avoid these chronic reinfestations. Make sure kids are showering daily, especially in the morning. Now, this isn't essential for every single child, but if your child is one of these kids that are getting worms really regularly, then you want to be making sure they're showering in the morning and washing around the bottom and genitals to ensure that they're getting rid of any of the eggs that have been laid overnight. Because once they hatch on the outside of the body, then they are making their way back into the inside of the body. We want to be changing linen, PJs, and underwear regularly, and washing them in hot water is thought to be the most effective at sort of getting rid of those, killing off the eggs that might be in those on those clothings and fabrics. We want to make sure our children's fingernails are trimmed to minimize the spread of eggs from underneath the nails. Oh, this is a bugbear of me for me with my 12-year-old. She's got gorgeous nails and she loves growing them long. But for lots of different hygienic reasons, it's better to keep our kids' fingernails short. Ensure our kids are washing their hands with soap and water regularly, including when they first wake up, because it's in their sleep that they're, itching around their bottom, and infect, so those eggs are on their hands. Wipe any surfaces that are regularly touched by our kids with hot water and a cloth. As I said, the eggs can live for quite a long time outside of the body. So think about things like light switches, taps, door handles, and the toilet flusher. And don't forget to treat the whole family, even if only one child is showing symptoms. As I said before, some kids are symptom-free. So we want to make sure we're treating the whole family. One question I often get is, should we be treating for worms regularly, even if our kids aren't showing any signs and symptoms? Look, personally, I choose not to. We only treat for worms when someone has symptoms, but it's, there's nothing terrible, or there's not going to be any major kind of downsides to treating your family every 18 months to 2 years, for example. Some people even choose to do it every 12 months. Because some people can be asymptomatic, it could potentially be a good idea. And lastly, I want to talk about some of the upsides to worm infections. This sounds very bizarre, but believe it or not, there are some benefits associated with having worms. So some research suggests that worms can be protective for the immune system, particularly for autoimmune conditions. People with worm infections have been shown in studies to be less likely to develop autoimmune conditions. And I've popped some links to the research on these different areas that I've been talking about in the podcast in the worm article that I'll link in the show notes, so you can click through and read more on the research if you want to. So worms have also been shown to be protective against allergies and atopic conditions such as eczema, at least in the short term. Chronic worm infections can suppress immunity, but short-term infections seem to modulate or balance the immune system, which has beneficial effects when we're talking about allergies and atopic conditions. There are also some links between worm infections and the diversity of bacteria bacteria in the gut. In studies, a gut that has had a worm infection had lower diversity, but when threadworm is present, the diversity increased. After treating the threadworm infection, the gut diversity increased even more. So the more diverse, if you haven't heard me say this before, the more diverse the gut bacteria, the healthier the immune system and gut. So on top of that, worms seem to emit substances that can reduce gut inflammation. One study showed that a worm infection leads to higher levels of short-chain fatty acids, and these protect the gut. So this does not mean we just want to leave worm infections. We want our kids to be putting up with symptoms. I'm not saying that at all. It doesn't mean that we don't need to treat worms in kids, but it does show that worm infections aren't as scary as we might think. They do seem to have some protective actions on when it comes to our kids' immune systems, or humans' immune systems as a whole. So I just wanted to add that really interesting information in there as well. So I hope this has been helpful. As I've said a few times through this episode, if you want some help treating your child with worms or recurrent worm infections, look at booking an appointment through our website. If you are a Natural Super Kids Club member, we have a treating or a worms cheat sheet for you. So this is all laid out in a really easy to navigate file, a PDF, and you can access that in your members portal. If you're not a Natural Super Kids Club member and you would love a place to get support and inspiration to boost the health and nutrition of your kids, and also to be able to navigate how to treat these common conditions and symptoms that we see in our kids, then you can hop on to the wait list and we will let you know when we next open. So in the club, we provide families with healthy recipes and meal plans and cheat sheets and masterclasses and naturopathic support, so that you can keep your family as healthy as possible. So pop on the wait list if that sounds like something you might want to be a part of. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. And please pass this on to anyone you know that might benefit. You can send them the link to the episode on our website, because I know this is a common problem that a lot of families face, not just one-off worm infections, but recurrent worm infections, and it can be really hard to get the help that you need. So please pass this on to anyone who you know is struggling with this. And I'd love to hear from you. If you liked this episode, send me a message on Instagram. You can find us at Natural Super Kids on Instagram, and I'd love to hear, what you found interesting about this episode. I will see you next week. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. Head on over to our website, naturalsuperkids.com, for the show notes for this episode, as well as a whole heap of inspiration to help you raise healthy and happy kids. I'll see you next week.